Hi, this is Brian from Music Lessons with Brian, and today I'm going to show you how to change the strings on your acoustic guitar. First, here's a few items that you'll need to help you get started. Here in my right hand I've got a peg winder, and as the name implies, this helps you wind the pegs. Without a peg winder, that job is pretty laborious, so make sure you head down to your local music store and pick something like this up before you get going. And here also is a collapsible tripod. This of course just supports the weight of the neck of the instrument, so that the headstock doesn't bang into the table while you're doing work. Alright, you also need some polish, and just a standard paper towel will do the job. Now the type of strings I'll be using today are from a company called D'Addario. They make a lot of strings for a lot of different instruments, and these particular strings, the EXP11s, are my personal favorite for my acoustic guitar. They're coated strings, so they tend to last a little bit longer, and that's a nice feature when you go through as many strings as I do. Alright, once you've got all these items together, you're ready to get started. The first step here is to loosen the tension on all the strings. You don't need to get them so loose that they are falling off, just loose enough so that they're not still at full tension. To do that, just take your peg winder, place it over the peg, and start turning clockwise. Now that all the string tension has been relieved, it's time to start pulling bridge pins. Now if you've been playing your guitar for a little while on the same set of strings, these bridge pins can get a little stuck inside this bridge, but that's alright because if you look closely at your peg winder, chances are it has this little notch, and what that does is sit underneath the head of the bridge pin and helps you get a good grip so you can pull it out. Now sometimes that's not quite enough, so what you can do is hold firmly with your left hand so the string stays in place, and then slide that bridge pin out. Repeat this step until all the bridge pins are removed, making sure that you keep close track of all your bridge pins because being so small, they're pretty easy to lose, and you can't change the strings on your guitar without them. Now that the strings are no longer attached to the bridge, it's time to remove the other end of the string from the headstock. To do this, I just bundle all the strings together to keep them from going astray, and with the other hand I start unwrapping around each of the tuning posts. Now be careful not to poke your fingers. The ends of these strings can be pretty sharp, and of course, if they're old, they're probably pretty dirty too. When I'm finished with that, I just wrap them all up, tie them in a knot. That way they stay together in the trash, where they belong. Having the strings taken off of your guitar gives you a great opportunity to clean the fretboard. Now if it's like mine and made of rosewood, it's got open pores which really collect a lot of dirt. And I find that a paper towel is just abrasive enough to pull some of that dirt out without being so abrasive that it scratches it too much. Now you don't want to use this paper towel on the rest of your guitar because if it's got a high gloss finish, that can kind of scratch it up. So just make sure that you only really get the fretboard when you do this part. Now the polish I'm using here is from Dunlop, their formula number 65. It's a pretty basic guitar cleaner and polish, so it's always good to have some on hand. And now it's time for the main event of putting your new guitar strings onto your guitar. As I mentioned before, we're using D'Addario EXP11's a coated string, and the way that D'Addario has been packaging their strings lately is like this, in this plastic envelope. Now what this does is it sort of seals in the freshness so that your strings aren't corroded by the time you even get them. Now, because they packed them all together, they use a color coding system to help you keep them all straight. Now if you look closely, you'll see that the ball end on the high E string, that's the thin one, is silver. And the ball end on the low E string is brass. And all the colors in between help you keep the rest of them sorted from each other. So just rip that open, pull them on out. And here you'll notice that they package them in twos. In my left hand there, I've got the two middle strings packaged together. I've got the two high strings packaged together here. And in my right hand are the two low strings. We'll get started with the low strings first. Now this is kind of the fun part. To unwrap these, you just undo that little part there and let it rip. Now this next part can get a little tricky. There's not a lot of margin for error here. Now basically what you're doing is just seating this ball end against the bridge pin inside the bridge assembly. Now you might assume that the ball end of the string sits at the base of the bridge pin. But actually, it really sits up against the side of the bridge pin. If you let it sit at the bottom, later when you start to tighten that string, the bridge pin could just fire out of there and you might never find it again. Now, it might really take a couple of times before you get the hang of this, but what you can do is with your left hand, hold the string firmly and then press the bridge pin with your thumb of the right hand past the ball end. You can feel this most of the time. Now that one end of the string is attached to the bridge, it's time to attach the other end of the string to the headstock. First, thread that string through the eye of the tuning post and pull it on through. Next, you'll need to determine the proper amount of slack for this portion of the string. There's a couple of ways to do this, and one's not necessarily better than the other, but you do want to prevent yourself from putting too much or too little of the string wrapped around that tuning post. Now, when finding the proper amount of slack for your string, I've seen some folks where they'll do this, they'll sort of lay their fingers up on the 6th fret or so. What I like to do is actually hold firmly with my left hand, and I'll pull the string, letting it slide through my left hand to the edge of the guitar. I find that gives me about the perfect amount of slack. Now, once you've made sort of a rough estimate of how much slack you're going to need to wrap around that tuning post, you want to make sure that you don't lose that slack by allowing the string to move back and forth through that tuning post. So, continue to hold it firmly with your left hand, and then with your right hand, wrap from the outside in. Now, what I'm doing is holding that firmly, and I'm keeping the slack with my second finger there, and pointing with my first finger sort of towards the headstock and holding the string in place. Now, once you've done that, and you've kind of got all the slack held up, then it's okay to let go with your left hand. Now, take that portion of the string that's sticking out and crimp it up against the side of the tuning post so that it's sticking straight up and down. This helps keep it out of the way when you start turning that peg a little bit later. Now, also take notice that the portion of the string in my right hand is over the portion of the string in my left hand. Now, once you start turning this tuner, you want to make sure that all the subsequent windings actually go underneath that other portion of the string, toward the headstock. This just helps increase the angle of the string across the nut, which gives you a better sound quality and helps you stay in tune. Now, the order of the strings goes from this point, the E, A, D, G, B, and E strings here, so from low to high. As you continue this process, even when you go to the other side, you want to make sure that all the wraps go from the outside of the headstock in towards the middle and across the nut. Again, when you're on this side of the guitar, from the outside in, and when you go to this side of the guitar, still from the outside in, just in reverse. Now, once I'm finished doing the low side of the strings, I like to switch over into the high side of the strings in reverse. So I start with the high E, and then I go to the B, and then I go to the G. Just makes it a little easier that way. So now you've got all your strings strung, but what you have to realize is that these strings take a little time to settle in. So as you put them on there and you start to tighten them up, what you'll notice is that the strings will pull with a lot of tension, and they'll start to squeeze that guitar together a little bit. So it takes a little bit of time to let the metal of the string stretch, let it settle up against the tuning post, and then to settle up against the bridge as well. So to help this along, sometimes I'll just kind of give it a rough tune, Doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of close to tension. That's really what you're trying to simulate here, is the tension. Now that I'm close, I just sort of grab each string and in a couple of different places, just kind of pull on it a little bit. And again, that just helps seat it up against the tuning post, up against the bridge pin, and also helps the metal in the string itself just stretch and relax a little bit. This process normally takes, I don't know, about 30 minutes or an hour to really happen if you're just playing the guitar after you put the new strings on it. This just kind of helps expedite that whole process. Okay, so now that all the strings are in place, it's time to start taking off this excess portion of the string sticking off your headstock. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can get some wire clippers, or if you've got a tuning peg winder like mine, it's got some sort of wire clippers attached to it. Now, I'm not particularly crazy about the wire cutters that come on these peg winders, but they're good to have in a pinch. I find that you just can't get quite close enough to that tuning post without having a little bit of that sharp portion of the string just sticking out. It can mess up the inside of your gig bag, it can cut your fingers if you hit it by accident. So what I'll do is I'll just take the string and sort of bend it back and forth until it breaks right off. And I love this because you don't need any extra tools, you just use your hands, and it gets you really close to that tuning post. Looks good, feels good, and I just repeat the process. Tink. 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 And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of many ways to change the strings on your acoustic guitar. Now, if you talk to 10 different players, they'll probably give you 10 different ways of doing this. And they'll probably also tell you that their way is the best. And I'm going to do the same thing. But the fact is, there's plenty of room for interpretation when you're changing the strings on your guitar, and one way isn't necessarily better or worse than another way. But if you use the suggestions that I gave you here today, with a little bit of practice, you'll have no problem changing the strings on your acoustic guitar. Thanks for watching.